Hello, and welcome to Encircled, the Halbe Pocket Podcast. Episode 4, the 22nd of April. The 22nd of April is an important day in our story because on this day, the first foundations for the German Ninth Army's escape westwards will be laid. The German defense strategy has been unraveled by the defeat at the Zelo Heights, and by now, 2 Soviet fronts are on the march across Brandenburg and they're even entering Berlin itself. These events will now finally force the German High Command to accept the reality staring them in the face. And this marks the moment when the High Command begrudgingly abandons Hitler's insistence on simply holding the line. Clearly, desperate times require desperate solutions. And thus, the 22nd of April is the day when the German leadership in the Führer bunker starts scrambling around for any far-fetched plan which might save Berlin from the Soviets. But before we dive into one of those desperate plans, let's first check in with the Ninth Army. So after their mauling at the Zelo Heights, and the loss of the 101st Corps and the 56th Panzer Corps, General Busse's remaining Ninth Army forces are now totaling around 80,000 men. This is down from their original total of around 200,000. However, 80,000 men is still a sizable body of troops, and General Heinrici once again called the Führer bunker, demanding permission for a large-scale retreat of the Ninth Army away from the Order front line. He argued that if the Ninth Army didn't immediately withdraw, they would be split in two and destroyed by nightfall. Hitler's ego, of course, wasn't simply going to admit defeat on the topic of withdrawal, but some semblance of sanity does seem to have prevailed, because at 10 to 3 in the afternoon, General Krebs rung Heinrici back to inform him that Hitler had given permission for the garrison defending Frankfurt Oder to pull back and link up with the rest of the Ninth Army. By withdrawing the garrison at Frankfurt Oder, Busse could shorten his overextended lines, strengthen his main body of forces, and perhaps even establish a new defensive line which might withstand further Soviet incursions. Now, this wasn't the full withdrawal of the Ninth Army which Heinrici had hoped for, and he snorted when hearing this order, as he knew it was a half measure at best which did nothing to stop the overall danger the Ninth Army was facing. But it did represent some flexibility from High Command. This new flexible approach from High Command was shown again only a few hours later when Heinrici received another phone call from the Führer bunker. This time, Heinrici was ordered to have Busse pull out his strongest 9th Army Division from the front line, march them westwards, mop up any Soviet resistance they came across, link up with the German 12th Army, and then march into Berlin to relieve the city from Soviet attack. Wait, what? Who's the 12th Army, I hear you say? Well, don't worry, dear listener, as your confusion at hearing the news of a sudden appearance of the 12th Army matches the surprise of Heinrici himself when he heard the news. As this marks the first time the 12th Army appears in our story, it's the perfect opportunity to explain who they are. The 12th Army had originally served in the Wehrmacht in the earlier years of the war, before they were incorporated into Army Group Center in 1943. However, in the spring of 1945, Hitler, who was desperately scraping together forces in the wake of the relentless Allied march across West Germany, had reformed the 12th Army in order to stop the American advance along the Elbe River from the west. Like many of the armies formed by the Wehrmacht in the dying days of the war, the 12th Army, on paper, was supposed to be a formidable body of troops, capable of impeding any attempt by the Americans to cross the Elbe. The reality, however, was quite different. Originally intended to comprise of 10 divisions, the 12th Army could only muster 5.5 divisions, totaling 55,000 men. The names of these divisions were impressive, and they harked back to a glorious German military past, with names such as Clausewitz, Potsdam, Ulrich von Hutten, Scharnhorst, Friedrich Ludwig Jahn, you get the idea. However, this army was yet another great example of the Wehrmacht having fallen on hard times, with the ranks filled with young cadets and training officers who lacked any real combat experience. Moreover, alongside the regular Wehrmacht units, the 12th Army also had many Volkssturm units composed of elderly men and young boys who had been given minimal training and inadequate weapons. The 12th Army also severely lacked armour, and initially it only possessed 12 tanks, although it did eventually gain more tanks and self-propelled guns later. But whilst the army lacked manpower and firepower, it nevertheless had the good fortune of counting one of the Wehrmacht's finest generals as its commander. General Walter Wenck was the youngest general serving in the Wehrmacht, and he proved to be a real rarity during the final stages of the war. Wenck was loyal to his men, and he wasn't one of those typical Wehrmacht generals who slavishly followed Hitler's increasingly bizarre demands. He was a capable and energetic leader who, recognizing the limited resources his army possessed, decided to use his units as shock troops, which could be rapidly deployed to the areas needed most. Wenck's careful deployment of his limited resources had seen the 12th Army score some impressive victories against the Americans in early April, which was one important factor as to why the American advance had slowed. Beyond Wenck's tactical qualities, however, he was also a caring commander, and he was able to inspire his raw troops to go above and beyond in their duty, despite their lack of fighting experience. These qualities, both in Wenck and his 12th Army men, would prove crucial to the fate of the 9th Army later in the story. Since the activation of the 12th Army, it had been tasked with defending a 125-mile-long stretch of the Elbe, forming a shield defending the western approaches to Berlin. Yet the collapse of the German front to the east of Berlin was forcing Hitler to desperately clutch at straws for any German forces which could ride to Berlin's rescue and prevent the city from falling into Soviet hands. Hitler, with Field Marshal Keitel, cast their eyes over the 12th Army along the Elbe, and they gambled that the 12th Army could turn away from the Americans and race towards Berlin to relieve the city, as they assumed it was unlikely the Americans would advance from their positions on the western bank of the Elbe. In any case, whatever the Americans may or may not do was a secondary concern to Hitler and his generals, because the Soviet threat was literally knocking on the door of Berlin, so this was the way bigger threat right now. Hitler, probably under the influence of lots of drugs, devised a desperate scheme to save Berlin, which would consist of a multi-front German force stopping and then destroying the Soviet advance to the north, west, and south of the city. In the north, Hitler ordered the famous Steiner and his newly christened Army Detachment Steiner to attack the Soviets. To the west and south, Hitler's plan called for Wenck's 12th Army to link up with Busse's 9th Army and for those two forces to lead a combined counterattack towards Berlin. Field Marshal Keitel was ordered by Hitler to coordinate the actions of the 12th and 9th Armies, and he left the Führer bunker on the evening of the 22nd to travel to Wenck's headquarters along the Elbe to deliver his orders in person. Meanwhile, General Krebs phoned Heinrici and informed him of Hitler's new plan to have the 12th and 9th Armies link up and relieve Berlin from the south. Whilst surprised at the news, Heinrici dryly replied that the 12th Army would be most welcome. Now, it's understandable that Heinrici's enthusiasm was muted, because in his eyes, the 9th Army was facing imminent destruction unless it was rapidly withdrawn from the front line. Yes, Hitler's order had sanctioned the transfer westwards of Busse's strongest division, but it did nothing to save the rest of the 9th Army, who would still be expected to hold the order front line, a task which was made even more difficult now with the redeployment westwards of Busse's strongest troops. However, Hitler's plan had left the door ajar for the potential that the 9th Army wouldn't just be simply sacrificed along the order front line. And Heinrici was determined to use this slim opportunity, as he still believed the 9th Army was strong enough to withdraw to the west. Heinrici therefore quickly telephoned Busse, and he ordered him to immediately pull out his strongest division, have it break through the Russian lines, and send it westwards to meet up with Wenck's 12th Army. Busse rightly complained that this would strip him of his strongest forces, weakening his position further, but Heinrici was in no mood to discuss the topic. He firmly informed Busse that this was an order, before putting down the phone. The likelihood of the German 12th and 9th Armies linking up and launching a successful relief of Berlin from the south was laughable, given the overwhelming might of the Soviet forces in play and the undermanned and undergunned Wehrmacht forces being tasked with this objective. To all intents and purposes, Berlin was already lost, and everyone except Hitler knew this. But as we'll explore in the next episode, Heinrich, Busse, and Wenck would cannily use this plan not to save Hitler in Berlin, but to instead save as many German soldiers and civilians as possible. Whilst plans were being hatched to enable the Ninth Army to escape westwards, the Soviets had not been sitting on their hands. They had also seen the developments on the battlefield, and they recognized the opportunity laid out before them. The Soviets were clearly enjoying the upper hand during their final assault in Berlin, but they had not yet encircled the city. Plus, they had also not yet cut off the possibility that supporting German forces might disrupt their attack on Berlin. Therefore, on the night of the 22nd of April, Moscow ordered both Zhukov and Konyev to ensure that they encircled the German Ninth Army in order to A. prevent it from relieving Berlin, and B. to prevent it from escaping to the west. What's key to note here, however, is that this order called for an encirclement and containment strategy, and thus it did not yet call for the annihilation of those encircled German forces. So a warning to you listeners, in order to describe the movements on the battlefield by the Soviet armies, I will be referencing lots of town names in Brandenburg. So in order to follow along, please go back to the map I linked to in the description of episode 1. Zhukov and Konyev still maintained their laser focus on the prize of Berlin, but they reacted to this new directive from Moscow by issuing orders to their respective forces to prevent the escape of the Ninth Army. Konyev ordered the 28th Army to concentrate its troops on the Bornsdorf, Mittenwalde and Teupitz area, and for those troops to set up an array of defensive lines facing the Ninth Army which would prevent any breakout westwards. Konyev also ordered his 3rd Guards Tank Army to occupy Bukow near Schönefeld south of Berlin, and for that army to prepare to link up with the advancing forces from Zhukov's 1st Belarusian front. A link up there would then formally encircle the Ninth Army between the two Soviet fronts. Meanwhile, Konyev's 3rd Guards Army was ordered to start attacking the German Ninth Army directly. Zhukov reacted to Moscow's directive by ordering his 3rd Army to attack in the direction of Wildau, Brusendorf, Juensdorf and Mischendorf, and then move immediately on to securing the area around Gorsen. Zhukov's 2nd Guards Cavalry Corps was ordered to attack in a southerly direction towards the towns of Busch and Leibsch before moving on to Krausneck. His 33rd Army was to launch a head-on attack on Ninth Army forces stationed in the Bieskul and Altschadl areas. And lastly, Zhukov's 69th Army was ordered to attack in the direction of Scharmützelsee, where the German 9th Army Command was now headquartered. As we can see, there was a stark contrast in Konyev and Zhukov's strategies. Konyev's approach was one largely of encirclement and containment on the western flank of the Ninth Army. Zhukov, however, favoured a more head-on approach, where the German Ninth Army would be attacked from multiple directions. The intention here was to break the main body of Ninth Army troops into smaller parts, which could then be destroyed piecemeal. Both Konyev and Zhukov put their plans into action, and they moved their forces into position. So from now on, the German Ninth Army would truly be between a rock and a hard place. They would be facing head-on attacks from Zhukov's forces to the north, east and south, with any further retreat westwards rendered almost impossible by the defensive lines of Konyev's forces. It was clear to all that the German Ninth Army would soon be trapped.